All right. Hello, Worldly Global people. Just wanted to record this lesson for those of you that weren't able to make it to the live lesson. I think this may help you out quite a bit. This is our lesson for the week. We're going to be looking at Indian Ocean trade. So we've been looking at uh, trade and exploration across the Atlantic Ocean. But there was also trade that occurred across the Indian Ocean as well. That is often overlooked, but it was still nonetheless very, very important. So that's what we're going to look at this week. Okay, so how are we going to go about doing this? Well, we're going to start with opening up the document. There it is. And there's three parts to this. Part one, we're going to develop background knowledge. Okay. And Indian Ocean Trade Network was also known as the Monsoon Marketplace. I want you to tell me, why is this a good name for the Indian Ocean trade routes? And how are you going to figure this out? Well, there is a brief video clip here. It's a thought bubble from Crash Course. It's about a minute long. It really explains well as to why this term monsoon was really important in creating Indian Ocean trade. There's also a map here too that I'd like you to take a look at that may help you in answering this question. And hopefully it will load up a little quicker than it did last time. Okay, so this map, which you'll see if it loads up anytime soon, is a map of Africa and Asia. And over here is the Indian Ocean. Okay. And this is where the Indian Ocean trade took place. So it took place between Africa, as you can see, and Asia. Okay. And it's also known as the Monsoon Marketplace. Well, why is it known as the Monsoon Marketplace? Well, they had these things called monsoon winds. I think a lot of times you think of monsoon, you think of like downpours and rain, uh, that were especially that are especially true in places like India. Well, for our purposes, we want to think of monsoon as in the monsoon winds, and these winds would change based on what season it was. So if it was in the summer months, these summer winds would blow from Africa up to Asia. That made it very easy for traders and sailors to be able to travel from Africa to Asia during those months. And it was like clockwork. It would happen every summer during the summer months. So, what they would do is traders from Africa would sail over here to Asia. They would pick up all the goods they wanted to get, go to the Spice Islands, get some spices, black pepper. They go to India and they get some cotton, that kind of thing. They might go to China to get some ivory. And then once they've collected all this stuff that they're going to trade in Africa, they would have to wait for the winter monsoon winds. And again, very reliable winds would happen like clockwork every winter season. All of a sudden, the winds would shift and they would blow back in this direction. That would allow sailors and traders to go ahead and sail back to Africa. So, remember, the question was, why is Monsoon Marketplace a good name for the Indian Ocean trade routes? And hopefully, you got something out of this about the monsoon winds. So monsoon winds should definitely be in your response, right? And why would they be in your response? Well, monsoon winds made it possible for sailors to trade between Africa and Asia, right? These winds were very predictable, which is really important as well. So they knew that, hey, it's the summer months. We need to get ready. We need to travel over to Asia and vice versa. Okay, so that's your answer to part one. Part two is a reading. Okay, where you're going to develop more knowledge. I will read it to you. I'm not going to type out each and every question, but I will mention some important information you can use to answer your questions. Okay, so the questions line up really well with where you are in the part of the reading. So it should be relatively easy for you. All right, I'll begin reading. It says Indian Ocean trade was a network of trade routes that connected people who had stuff to people who wanted it and were willing to pay for it. And just like other trade routes we've learned about this year, like the Silk Road, it was not just a single road or route. There were lots of Indian Ocean trade routes connecting various port cities around the Indian Ocean basin, including Zanzibar and Mogadishu and Hormuz and Canton. So it says to describe ocean trade in your own words. Using this paragraph, I might say it was a network of trade routes that connected people um, across the Indian Ocean. Done. All right. Next paragraph. And what we want to answer here is what parts of the world took part in the Indian Ocean trade? So by about 700 CE, which is just a fancy way of saying AD, there was a recognizable Indian Ocean trade network, but it really blew up between 1000 CE and 1200. It then declined a bit during the Pax Mongolica when overland trade became cheap and safe, but then Indian Ocean trade surged again in the 14th and 15th centuries. So who was trading? Swahili coast cities, Islamic empires in the Middle East, India, China, Southeast Asia, and not Europe, which is probably one of the reasons that the Indian Ocean Trade Network isn't as famous as it should be. I really want you to remember this part. The fact that Europe was not, for the most part, a part of Indian Ocean trade is a big reason why Indian Ocean trade is often overlooked, even though it shouldn't be. It was still an incredibly important trade network. Okay, so we want to answer the question, what parts of the world took part in the Indian Ocean trade? Well, it's all listed here, but overall, I would say the Middle East, India, China, and Asia. Okay, moving on to the next paragraph. So we want to answer the question, how were monsoon winds important to Indian Ocean trade? We're going to read about it some more, but we just answered that in the initial question of the lesson. So if you remember, monsoon winds were important to Indian Ocean trade because they were so reliable that these sailors used these monsoon winds to be able to reliably transport goods, depending on what season it was. Okay. So it says, so if you live in China and you need some ivory to make a handle for a sword, you have to trade for it because elephants only live in India and Africa. One of the reasons Indian Ocean trade took off is that there were a wide range of resources available and a wide range of import needs, from ivory to timber to books to grain. But the most important thing was the wind. So this paragraph is not going to answer anything about why monsoon winds were important to Indian Ocean trade, but it's just another reminder of why Indian Ocean trade took off and was so important. And basically, there was a lot of different types of materials available for trade, and there was a lot of different people who wanted lots of different things. So it was a mutually beneficial trade. All right. This paragraph is where we're going to answer the stuff about the monsoon winds. So it says the Indian Ocean is home to a set of very special winds called monsoons. You generally hear about monsoons in the context of rain in India, but r- rather than thinking of monsoons as the rain itself, think of them as the wind that brings a rainy season. The great thing about seasons is that they come regularly, and so do the monsoon winds. So if you were a sailor, you could count on the wind to bring you from Africa to India if you sailed between April and September, Remember those summer monsoon winds. Uh, and one that would bring you back to Africa if you sailed between November and February. Remember, those winter monsoon winds would blow from the direction of Asia and India back to Africa. In fact, these winds were so predictable that early maritime travel guides often listed ideal times of departure down to the week and sometimes even the day. All right, so let's answer this question. How were monsoon winds important to the Indian Ocean trade? Well, you could see they were, as a sailor, very predictable. So you knew exactly when you needed to have your boats ready to sail from, say, Africa to India, because you knew between April and September, these monsoon winds would be blowing in that direction. So that's why monsoon winds were so important for trade. Without them, sailors would not be able to reliably sail from Africa to India and back again. Okay, next paragraph. Who participated in Indian Ocean trade? There are a few more facets of Indian Ocean trade worth mentioning. First, Indian Ocean trade incorporated a diverse group of people. There were Jewish people and people from Africa to Malaysia and Indian and China, all sailing around and setting up trading communities where they would act as middlemen, trying to sell stuff for more than they bought it for and trying to find new stuff to buy that they could sell later. But despite this diversity, for the most part, especially the western half of the Indian Ocean basin, the trade was dominated by Muslim merchants. So, who participated in Indian Ocean trade? Well, it lists these people here: Jewish people, people from Africa, people from India and China. But the most important people that dominated this trade, of course, were Muslim merchants. And we learned about this earlier this year, how important Muslims were in trade and how important that was in spreading their culture and religion. Okay, now we're going to look at, well, what products and technologies moved around the Indian Ocean. And we're going to be able to answer this question in the next two paragraphs. Okay. First paragraph is going to be about the products that were moved around the Indian Ocean trade. And this second paragraph is going to be the technology that spread. So I'd like you to just think about one thing each to write about. Okay. So let's think about what products moved around. Africa produced a lot of raw materials like animal hides and skin, and ivory and gold. The Swahili city states imported finished goods such as silk and porcelain from China and cotton from India. China also produced gunpowder and printing, especially of books. Spices and foodstuffs like rice were shipped from Southeast Asia and especially Sri Lanka, where black pepper was a primary export good. And the Islamic world provided everything from coffee to books and weapons. But it wasn't just products that made their way around the Eastern Hemisphere thanks to the Indian Ocean. All right, so the first part of this question is what products moved around the Indian Ocean? They talked about a lot of different products. You don't have to write down each and every one. Pick one or two. The thing that stood out to me was this ivory and gold. And I might even talk about spices like black pepper that were also primary exports. So the second half of the question is which technologies were exchanged. So we'll read that here right now. It says technology spread too, like the magnetic compass, which is kind of crucial if you like to know where you're going. That came from China. Muslim sailors popularized the astrolabe, which made it easier to navigate by the stars. Boats used stern post rudders, were easier to steer, so that technology quickly spread through the monsoon marketplace, a nickname given to this network or trade routes along the Indian Ocean. The Islamic world also produced the triangular lateen sail, which became super important because it allowed for ships to tack against the wind. This meant that a skilled crew could make their way through the ocean even if they didn't have a strong tailwind. And just as with the Silk Road and other trade routes, ideas also traveled in the monsoon marketplace. Well, so what technologies moved around the Indian Ocean trade? Compass was mentioned, the astrolabe was mentioned, and these lateen sails were incredibly important because we know that they relied on the monsoon winds, so they could only travel to India and Asia from Africa during the summer months. But with these lateen sails, They didn't have to rely on the wind going in a certain direction. They could go to India and China during the winter months if they wanted to, because these lateen sails were able to adjust to the winds. Okay, last question. How did Indian Ocean trade impact Indonesia? What is the term for this kind of exchange? That'll be in this last paragraph here. It says, for instance, today more Muslims live in Indonesia than any other country. Knowing what you've already learned about the growth of Islam and the spread of trade, it won't surprise you to learn that Islam spread to Indonesia via the monsoon marketplace. After the 1200s, the region, which had previously been heavily influenced by the Indian religions of Hinduism and Buddhism, became increasingly Islamic as rulers and elites adopted the religion so they could have religious as well as economic ties to the people they were trading with. The conversion of most of a region to Islam, which it continues to flourish today, is a pretty big deal. But Islam didn't spread as effectively to Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, or Vietnam because they weren't centers of trade. So, how did Indian Ocean trade impact Indonesia? Well, it made Indonesia mostly Muslim. And it doesn't say this in here, but what is the term for this kind of exchange? It's known as cultural exchange. And we learned about this when we looked at the Muslim religion earlier this year. Remember, Muslim traders not only traded goods, but they influenced different regions with their religion. If you remember, if you were a Muslim merchant, you didn't have to pay taxes in Muslim regions. Whereas if you were a non Muslim trader, they would still accept you, but you would have to pay certain taxes that a non Muslim wouldn't have to pay. Okay, so there's a wrap up question here. It says to explain how Indian Ocean trade impacted the countries that participated in it. Hopefully, you write something about how there was an exchange of culture in religion. You could talk about how simply there was an exchange of different goods that people needed. And then finally, you could talk about how technology was exchanged as well. Okay. And then finally, this last part here, your wrap up question. We learned today that the Indian Ocean Trade Network was incredibly important, but is often overlooked, right? We pay a lot of attention to the age of exploration trade routes, right? The slave trade, the triangular trade, mercantilism. We study a lot about the Silk Road as well. But for the most part, we don't spend very much time on this Indian Ocean trade. So I want you to tell me why you think that might be. And there's some guiding questions that will help you with this. Okay. So part A for the guiding question says identify one region or continent that did not participate in an Indian Ocean trade. And well, Europe was not really a part of that, which is a really big reason why it's often overlooked because there's no European influence. Um, and so you'd want to describe then some of the important products that were exchanged uh, through Indian Ocean trade. You'd want to probably talk about the spices. You'd want to talk about um, ivory and gold and all these important products that were exchanged. And then finally, you also want to talk about some of the important ideas that were exchanged, especially the important technology that was exchanged through this Indian Ocean trade. Once you're done with that, please make sure you turn it in via Google Classroom, and you are done for the week. One thing I wanted to point out to you guys before I go is I started this last week. And I only got one person who signed up for it, but I would love to see some more of you if you need it to sign up for this. As you know, Wednesdays are dubbed Wellness Wednesdays. So I know there is some sort of lesson that the counselors do with you. But besides that, it's also there for you to use as a day to really just sort of catch up on your work. So there is no formal class meeting. So I thought it might be a good opportunity for you guys to be able to sign up if you need the help. You're not required to do this, but to sign up for extra help, one-on-one help. So what I've done is, and this will be in your Google Classroom on Tuesday night, is I've given you the ability to sign up for 30-minute slots. that work for you. There are morning slots and there are afternoon slots. Sign up for any 30-minute window of time that works for you, and I will send you further information in an email with a link to our Google Meeting um, web link that can connect us so that we can, meet together in video conference. That way, in my opinion, it'll really help you to catch up if you need to catch up, or it'll clarify any questions or problems you're having with any of the assignments. Okay. As always, I am available through email as well. You can always email me, and I'm usually pretty quick to get back to you, or you can message